Welcome to Inside the GMAT. I'm your host, Zach. If you've ever thought the GMAT was just a test of math and grammar, you're not alone. And you're also not quite right. The GMAT is designed to measure how you think, not just what you know. So if your prep plan is all about memorizing formulas or hunting for quick tricks, you might be setting yourself up for some frustration. Today, I'm joined by Sergey Kouk from Admit Master to talk about a skills-based approach to GMAT prep, how to train your reasoning abilities, build confidence, and ultimately reach your target GMAT score. Sergey's here to explain why the GMAT is more like learning to drive a car than cramming for an exam, and how his methods help test takers perform at their best on test day. So let's get into it. Sergey, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Zach, and welcome everyone. Ambitious people who are working hard to getting a high GMAT score and realizing your dreams of going to your dream business school.
Yes, they're all listening ambitiously. So before we jump into some of this skills-based approach to GMAT prep, how did you wind up in the prep world? Were you always a great test taker?
Well, that's actually a great question. When I decided to do my own MBA, because at that point I realized that my career is stalling a little bit. I was 27 years old, and I just thought, well, what can I do to push my career forward? And somebody suggested that I look into the MBA. I didn't know what is the MBA before, so I started doing research and I realized I needed to do the GMAT. Well, I did a practice test. I did a few practice questions, and 2 weeks later, I got a score of 750. So people are asking me, well, how did you pull this off? How did you actually get such a high score within just 2 weeks of preparation? And as I was doing reflection, I actually realized that I already had the skills, or the majority of the skills that were needed for the success on the GMAT. And I just got very lucky in my secondary school. I had some amazing teachers who actually taught me how to think differently. I participated in some math Olympiads and things like that. And that's how I ended up getting a very high score myself. After doing my MBA and working in the corporate world, a few years later, I actually just met some friends who were in the test preparation business. And I thought what they were doing, they actually invited me to stand in for some of the teachers who were absent. And some of the students came to me after the class and said, Sergey, can we have you as a teacher? We want you instead of that person. We don't want that person to come back. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So maybe I'm not just a good test taker myself, but I can also maybe teach other people if I actually learn how to do this. And the rest is history.
I feel bad for that guy you replaced.
Me too.
He's going to be our guest next week. So like I said in the introduction, and like we've talked about this before briefly, a lot of test takers believe that the GMAT is just about math and grammar. Why do you think that misconception is so widespread?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's probably something that has to do with the way we were educated, because let's just face it, our educational system has been designed 150 years ago, before we had ChatGPT and Google and everything else. So at that time, the government, the society wanted to institute universal education because people are lacking that knowledge. Many people didn't know how to count. And of course, you need to do that to participate in the economy. Many people didn't know how to read and write. So that's what we designed. I know you're looking at this right now and thinking, well, almost everybody knows how to count and how to read, but that's when our educational system was originally designed. So over the time, over these many years, that perception that knowledge is power continued to persist. And many people still to this day, or at least maybe many teachers, believe that knowledge is power. So that's why a lot of the exams that we are doing or we have been doing are essentially testing how well we know something. And that's why when we're facing with a new exam, such as the GMAT, we automatically apply the same patterns. Oh, it's about something I need to demonstrate, that's something that I know, and then they look at the structure of the test, and they're looking at the quantitative and verbal, and they're thinking, okay, there's some math, there's some English involved, and I don't really know about this new section. What does it really mean, right? But math and English, and that's the immediate perception of many people.
So are you saying that there's a difference between knowledge and reasoning skills? Because I know that's something that you're very keen on, which is this idea that nobody's really born with strong reasoning skills.
Exactly. And that is actually one of the reasons why, regardless of your background, anybody can do well on a test such as the GMAT if they take the right steps. But you're absolutely correct, Zach. Knowledge used to be power, but it no longer is power. If you don't know something in the real world, you can get that knowledge really quickly. Though what you do with that knowledge, how do you take advantage of it? What sorts of decisions do you make with that knowledge? And do you make these decisions fast enough so you can act on them maybe before everyone else while you have this window and opportunity? That's a skill and not the knowledge anymore. And similarly to how we were not really born with knowledge, we weren't really even born with skills. I mean, I love analogies. So very often when I speak with my students, I would say, look, when you were born, you didn't know how to walk, how to talk. You had some really basic skills, like maybe you knew how to cry and some other things. But over time, you've developed a lot of skills. So similarly on the GMAT, if we accept this notion that the GMAT isn't really about knowing formulas, but it's more about demonstrating the skills that are relevant to the business school. And we'll realize that just like with any skill, these sorts of skills can also be developed over time. And I sometimes also use my own example. I say, how do you think I was able to do really well on this test with just 2 weeks of preparation? If this was a test of knowledge, and I've done some knowledge-based tests. For example, some time ago, I've done the first level of CFA, and it's a test that requires learning a lot of things and actually gaining a lot of knowledge, going through a lot of different books. And it took me almost 3 months studying 4 or 5 hours a day to get ready for this test. Whereas on the GMAT, I was able to do it much faster. And the reason why I'm providing this example is not necessarily to say that the GMAT's an easier exam, but to say that if you have the skills, or if you take the time to develop these skills, whether you do this earlier in your career, just like I did, when I didn't even know what is the GMAT, but somebody taught me these reasoning skills and I was just able to apply them to the GMAT. Or if maybe you didn't have good teachers that taught you these skills, you can still learn them now. And then how do you develop these skills? Because most of us are used to studying for a knowledge-based test. So we have these patterns. Most of us have done a lot of knowledge-based tests, right? And how do you prepare for a knowledge-based test? Go to a library, go to a bookstore, pick up a book, read the book. If you finish 50% of the book, you're probably 50% ready. Finish 100% of the book, you're probably 100% ready. So long as you remember what's in the book, you're ready for the exam. And then what usually happens is maybe a week later, I know I've been there, certainly when I was passing my theoretical physics exams. A couple of weeks later, you probably don't remember the names of the molecules and all of these particles, but that's okay. You've passed the exam. So many of us, when they are faced with another exam, that's what we do. That's the first thing that many people do. They say, okay, another exam, let me grab a book. But if this is not a knowledge-based exam, but the skills-based exam, reading half of the book or the whole book may not necessarily get you ready for the exam. So what do you do instead? Well, then maybe what we need to do is, instead of following the pattern of preparing for a knowledge-based test, we should follow a pattern of preparing for a skills-based test. And this is where a lot of people get a little confused, because most of the tests we have done are actually not skills-based tests. So what's the frame of reference for those tests? And the easiest frame of reference for many people is a driving test, because driving is a skill. When you go to pass your driving test, the examiner will usually won't just ask, do you know how to drive? And they'll say, yes, I do. And they'll say, okay, perfect. That's it. You can go and drive, right? That's not how these things work. They usually will say, show me. Can you actually do this? Demonstrate the skill. And that's what the GMAT's also about. When you have questions on the GMAT, every question is going to be the question you have never seen before. Just like when you're driving, every time you get on a road, something is different. The cars are different, the weather is different. So simply memorizing how things were a day ago is not going to help. You need to develop these skills. Now, how do we do this? Let's go back to that model. And that's how we structure our programs here at AdmitMaster as well. And what we find is that many people do things a little bit backward. So maybe let's walk through these steps first. When we learned how to drive a car, usually step number one was to read the driver's guidebook and memorize some rules of the road. For example, if you have this red octagon, that means you got to stop. Green means go and red means stop. And usually in many of the states and provinces in Canada or in some other parts of the world, we have what's called the graduated licensing system, where you first get the first type of a license. This is when you pass the written test. This shows that you know the rules of the road. Similarly on the GMAT, when you are preparing for the test, knowing what is a prime number is important. Knowing how to add fractions is important. If you don't know what is a prime number and you're trying to go and take the test, you probably are going to fail. Let's face it. So some knowledge is required, but not a lot. In fact, I usually suggest when people are speaking with me and I do a lot of one-on-one consultations, and when candidates ask, well, where do I start? I usually suggest, well, look, start with the official guide. There's a great chapter that's called the Math Review chapter. It explains pretty much everything you need to know about math. And then people are surprised that there are only about 40 pages or so in that Math Review chapter. This is not to say that there's not enough to remember. I mean, 40 pages is still a lot. But this is certainly not what many people expect, where they're saying, well, I need to read books and books and books on remembering the foundations. The foundations are just there to help you demonstrate these reasoning skills. So you need to have the foundations, but this is not where the majority of your preparation is going to lay. So that's step one. Once you're comfortable with foundations, once essentially you got your first written license, what's the next step? Well, if we talk about driving a car, then the next step is usually not, Mom, Dad, give me the keys. I'm just going to go and drive. That's not how things usually work, right? On the GMAT, though, and the reason why it doesn't work this way is because the cost of making a mistake when you're driving is very high. You can get into a lot of trouble. So that's why there's some rules in place for us to make sure that we don't do things that we're not supposed to do. When it comes to the GMAT, though, well, many people believe, okay, well, I'm just going to try different things and, it's okay. It's not like a driving test. So if I make a mistake, not a big deal. If I try different things and it doesn't really work. But what I realized, though, is that many people, when they just begin studying for the test, and like even if somebody goes on the GMAC website and looks at some statistics to how many people are thinking about studying for the test, how many people are thinking of going into a business school, and the number is somewhere in the millions every year, and how many people end up actually doing the test, it's quite mind-boggling that there's such a small percentage of people who will actually see that journey all the way till the end and will be successful in getting to a business school. So many people at some point just fall off this funnel and don't follow through. So when we're doing something that doesn't work, when we're trying things and we just don't see the results, then this is where a lot of people give up. So the potential cost of not studying properly and not actually getting the results that you want, not fulfilling your dreams, is also quite high. It's literally, if you look at the return on investment from the MBA programs, it's in the millions of dollars. So if you're thinking about this, when somebody is just saying, okay, should I study for the test properly? Should I develop these skills? Or should I maybe take some shortcuts or maybe try not to do the test like this and maybe not do the MBA? Then the cost is also quite high. It's all about the perspective. So that's why, even though the Ministry of Transportation doesn't impose on us the way to study for the test, just like they do with driving, but we want to follow a pretty similar pattern. So what is that pattern? Well, you probably remember when you learned how to drive a car, after passing the written test, the next step would be to actually learn how to drive. And how do we do that? Well, if you try to drive for the first time, like if you remember the first time you were behind the wheel, how did it feel?
Scary. Honestly, scary.
Yeah, I know.
My dad was going to yell at me no matter what I did.
Exactly. And, kudos to your dad for actually being in a car with you. Most people, they don't have just enough patience or their nerves are not strong enough to take their kids to driving. So they would usually just throw them in a school. Because I usually also ask my students, I say, what is the chance that when you're doing something for the first time in your life, you might make some mistakes? And they usually agree that the chance is 100%. Some people are being very optimistic and they say 99%. But it's usually very close to 100%. So that's why we have this instructor there. So what does this person do? This person, the driving instructor, does a few very important things. Number one, they show us how to do it. They actually walk us through the process, right? Maybe they're behind the wheel themselves first, and they just say, okay, here's how you do things. Yeah, it's great that you read something in the book, but the book just says green means go and red means stop. Now, how do you actually go and how do you actually stop? That's what somebody needs to show you. Now, this could be a YouTube video. This could be a real person. Right? So somebody needs to show you. That's one thing that they do. Another thing that they do is they watch you do that and they give you feedback, which is something a YouTube video cannot really do. And this is actually very important because, again, let's go back to what's the chance of making a mistake. It's close to 100%. So when we're making a mistake, we want to fix that mistake, ideally, as soon as possible. And the most efficient way to fix that mistake is get that feedback. And here, if you allow me to use another analogy, but imagine this. Let's say I want to learn how to play golf. I'm going to go on a golf course and I'll just say, okay, I'm here to play golf. Here's, I just bought some clubs at Costco and here we go. I'm just going to go and play. Obviously, that's not going to work. So they're going to say, well, the first thing that you're going to do is go on a driving range. And just go and hit that damn ball 100,000 times until hopefully it gets to where it needs to go. So, and usually I have some students I teach a lot of classes. So now it's summertime. And I ask, who plays golf? And they say, yeah, I've been playing golf for 7 years or 10 years. And how good are you? So, well, I'm just kind of starting to become okay, right? So I said, what was the expectation the first time you were playing golf? Did you expect that you're going to be perfect? Absolutely not, right? So what you need to do is you need to just practice and practice and practice. The thing, though, is if I want to get better, instead of me trying to hit that ball and realize that maybe I'm just not holding my club well. Maybe that's why it's not going where it needs to go. Maybe I have a guy who is really good at playing. I have Tiger Woods. So I'm going to say, Tiger, come in. Please show me. What am I doing wrong? Even if he shows me how to do it, I might not be able to repeat it. I have to do it myself at some point, right? And if he looks at how I do this and he gives me personal feedback, I'm going to learn so much faster. That's why everybody has a coach. And even Tiger Woods has a coach. So that's the second and probably the most important thing that the instructor does is he gives that feedback so we can learn so much faster. And hopefully then not give up and realize our dreams faster, because also there's a pretty big opportunity cost for waiting to do the MBA. If somebody is ready, let's say they have 4 to 5 years of experience and now is the right time to do the MBA, well, they probably should do it soon as opposed to trying to study and trying to see what works and what doesn't work, and then realizing 5 years later, I want to do the MBA, but I already have 10, 11 years of experience, so maybe I'm not a good candidate anymore. So that's why that feedback is one of the most valuable things that a good instructor, whether a driving instructor or GMAT instructor, can provide. And then there's a third very important factor which kind of plays into the first two, and that is that person keeps you safe. Because if you remember when you learned how to drive a car, there was this second brake pedal that they had on the passenger side. So if they see that you're doing something that will get you into trouble, they can just press on that pedal and you're both safe. So the same thing with the GMAT. If somebody is going down the wrong path or they're about to give up, or there's something that's not working and they're stalling, then the instructor can help them get unstuck. Then that's quite an important factor. So that's essentially the second step. And this is where these driving classes came into play. This is where usually the GMAT classes, like, for example, we offer a lot of different programs for preparation, but our coaching program, our group coaching program with a live class, is still by far the most popular program because it really provides that very important second step in the preparation, which is learning the strategies, getting that feedback, and making sure that you still continue getting excited. And then there's a third very important step, and that is practice. Because in this jurisdiction where I am right now, we actually have 3 driver's licenses. First, a written license, then you get your first graduate license, and then second license. So the second license is something you can get after a year of driving. So that license essentially allows you to be a fully licensed driver. So why do they do that? Because practice is very important. Even if you come to a class and you just spend a few hours or 20, 30, 40, 50 hours with the instructor, if you don't practice yourself afterwards, you're not going to become really good. So practice is very important. But what we need to do things is in that order. First, you learn the rules, so formulas, what's a prime number. Then you learn the strategies. How do you actually do this? How do you drive a car? How do you approach question? If I see this sort of a question, how do I do that? And if I make a mistake, can I fix that mistake? And can somebody help me fix that mistake? And then finally, let me go and practice this a lot. Let me do 100 other questions so that I can get really familiar with these strategies and I can apply them effortlessly. And if you follow these steps, anybody can get a score of 645 or 700. They just need to follow these steps, and it doesn't matter what their background is. And I've seen this literally in thousands of people.
But when I think about higher order thinking skills, I don't know how can that be taught as easily as driving? I mean, with driving, you can put your hands on the wheel, you can put your feet on the pedals, you can, move the gears. There's so much hands-on experience, and it's hard for me to think about studying for the GMAT in the same hands-on way. Am I just thinking about it the wrong way?
I love the way that you're breaking this down because, think about this. When you learned how to drive a car, there were multiple steps that you needed to take, right? You get in a car, you turn on the ignition, switch the gears, you got to check the mirrors. So there are 20 different steps that you need to take. And it just feels so overwhelming. And the instructor will usually say, do this first. First, obviously, turn on the ignition, press the brake, then press the gas, and things like that. But then if I were to ask you, well, you're driving today, how many steps are there in driving? Many people say there's just one step. I get in a car and I drive. So similarly with the GMAT, even though it's a different skill, you could still break things down in step-by-step process. Let me just give you a very simple example. And there are obviously many different strategies, and that's why it takes, for example, for our classes, they're 6 weeks long, and they're quite intensive. We meet twice a week for 3.5 hours, and that's what we go through. But if I were to just try to boil it down in a very simple example, let's just take a quantitative reasoning question. That the type of that question is called problem solving. So what do most people do when they see a problem solving question? What do you think?
They try to figure out what the mathematical formula is.
You're absolutely right. They're trying to plug in the formula in order to try to solve the problem. Or they're thinking, okay, how do I turn this into an algebra equation so that I can actually solve it? And then once I solve it, they hope that the answer they get is among the answer choices. What if it's not? What if it is, but they've made a mistake? Because the GMAT, people who develop the test, they know these mistakes people are making. So the key to avoiding these mistakes is to try not to take these steps in the first place. I mean, yeah, there are many other steps, like you be careful and practice a lot. But what if instead of taking 20 steps, I can take 3? What if instead of asking myself, what is the formula I need in order to solve this problem, I'm going to ask myself a different question. I'm going to say, I have 5 answer choices in front of me. One of them is right, guaranteed. How do I find it among the 5 that are in front of me in the most efficient way with the least chance of making a mistake? If I start asking myself this question over and over and over again, and that's why we force our students when they come to the class to put their pen down and think for a few seconds, what is the strategy that they're going to be applying before they actually start writing the formula? And I still remember I had an amazing math teacher in school. I had an amazing phrase that I still remember to this day. He said, work fast, but don't rush. The GMAT is a very fast-paced exam, but you don't want to rush. So when many people are approaching the question, and even when I'm doing a lot of the consultations, I would often speak with candidates who would come to us and say, look, I know how to do these questions. I don't need help with these strategies. I know how to solve them. I just need help with timing. That's the only problem that I have. See, but the thing is that if you're doing something in 10 minutes, imagine doing it in 2 minutes. Are we going to rush? We're going to make lots of mistakes and probably won't get the right answer anyway. So what if instead of just rushing into this and jumping into this, we're going to develop a different set of skills? Maybe we're going to start asking ourselves some questions. And a great question is, how do I get to the answer in the most efficient way? But there's some other great questions like, what do I know about the question? What do I feel that I'm missing? Can I recognize some patterns, maybe from the questions that I've seen before, that will help me determine very quickly what is the strategy that I'm going to be using?
When I hear people talk about approaching the GMAT with strategy, with a strategic mindset, it feels a little pat. My background's in theater, and it always makes me think of getting a really bad note from a director that's like, do it again, but different or with feeling. What does that actually mean, right? But those questions actually help me immensely understand what you mean by being strategic. I love the idea of like looking at the answer choices as almost a challenge. Like, how do I get to these? That really helps me. But a question I do have about that is, and then we can jump into each section, is if somebody already has strong reasoning skills, is it still possible to perform poorly on the test? I suppose it is if somebody is rushing, as you say. Is that usually the thing that's holding them back?
Certainly, this could be one of the things. The important thing on the GMAT for all of our listeners to understand is that at the end of the day, this is a standardized test. So it's testing things a specific, particular way. I mean, think about this. The way that most standardized tests work, and this is how the tests were originally designed, standardized tests. Let's say you have a test at the end of the school year. Everybody comes into a big room. Everybody gets exactly the same test with 100 questions. And then the examiners are going to measure how many questions you get versus how many questions somebody else gets right. And that's how they assign a grade. Well, on the GMAT, things are different. You can do the test pretty much any day of the week, any time of the day. The online test's available 24/7. So how is this a standardized test? That's strange because everybody who's doing the test is doing it under different conditions. And most importantly, they're going to see different questions because it's an adaptive test. So the way they could be standardized, it's essentially testing the same things. Just have to get used to what the test is evaluating and how it's evaluating them. So somebody who has very strong reasoning skills, they might still not perform well if they don't practice enough in applying these reasoning skills to the GMAT. But the way you apply these skills to the GMAT is something that you need to learn. For example, one of the important skills that we teach in our class is to learn how to ask good questions. That's what we call critical thinking. Critical thinking isn't about criticizing everyone. It's about not taking things at face value. And we usually do this by asking the right questions. So if you learn how to ask good questions and really uncover some of the deeper meanings, some of the deeper things that are hidden perhaps, whether in a GMAT question or in a certain business situation, then you're obviously going to be more successful on the GMAT and in business as well. But what questions do you ask? In different circumstances, you might be asking different questions. Well, on the GMAT, there's some specific questions that you might want to ask. So if you know the questions to ask and you have good critical thinking skills, good reasoning skills, you're going to be able to find the answer. If you don't know what questions to ask, it's going to be much harder, even though you might have these skills. So that's why preparation is still important. Getting familiar with the questions, with the patterns is still important. But for people who already have these skills, they usually find it easier to prepare.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So let's talk more about those questions that we should be asking. And let's start with the quant section. What are some questions that people should be asking when they're facing these problem-solving questions?
Well, as we said, most people ask themselves this question: what is the formula I need to apply? What we usually suggest is then start by asking yourself a question: what do I already know from the passage? And ask yourself a question: what do I need to know? So you know something, and the question's asking for something else. There's a gap. How do you close this gap? This is where this critical thinking comes into play, because knowing, again, some patterns on the questions, knowing different types of questions will say, okay, if I know, for example, that I'm mixing two solutions and one is 2% and one is 10%, and the resultant solution is 5%, and I need to know, let's say, how much of the first solution was there, then I know how can apply certain specific strategies. And then you're asking yourself a question, what is that strategy that I'm going to apply? And then you actually start applying it. And you want to make sure that you always are focusing on answering that question that was asked. Because many of the wrong answers are going to be actually good answers just to some other questions. And that's true of quant, that's true of verbal, of data insights, and we call them clever traps. And if you're not careful, if you have two trains coming towards each other, and the question is asking you what was the distance that train A traveled, one of the answers might be the distance that train B traveled. Right? So you gotta be aware of this and make sure you are answering the right question. So at the end of this whole process, working on this question, you might want to ask yourself again, one more time, did I actually answer the correct question that was asked? And sometimes it's worth it just spending an extra 2 seconds checking whether you did. Because if you didn't, all of this work might be a waste. You might be able to do just a very quick correction and switch your answer just before you move on.
There's some questions in the quant section that are simply algebra problems where they don't have a lot of description in the question. Are these also the types of questions that you need to ask these questions?
Even with those problems, even though these problems are now a lot less common, you don't always have to solve them. Because sometimes you can, again, by asking yourself a question, how do I find one correct answer among the 5 options given in the most efficient way? Let me give you an example. I was doing a tutoring session yesterday with one of our clients, and the question was a pure algebra problem. And it was essentially asking something along the lines, what is x? And we were given a significant chunky fraction, and that fraction had a denominator, and the denominator had something like x minus 1 times x minus 4. And you need to find x. Well, guess what? If you look at the answer choices, one of the answer choices had x is equal to 1. Another answer choice had x is equal to 4. Well, when you're dividing by something like x minus 1, if x is equal to 1, then you're essentially dividing by 0. And we know you cannot divide by 0. So automatically, that option is not going to work. And actually, with that particular question, we ended up answering the question and finding x without doing any algebra, just by simply looking at what's possible, what's not possible, going through some reasoning steps. So yes, the questions you might ask yourself might be different, but you can still apply a lot of these reasoning skills. Now, this said though, yes, sometimes you have to solve the problem. So if you look at this and you ask yourself a question, what's the most efficient way for me to get to the answer? And you're feeling that the most efficient way is to solve the problem, then that's what you need to do. But you still need to ask yourself this question, because if you don't, by default, we're just trying to solve the problem 100% of the time. And it is definitely not the preferred approach 100% of the time.
I think a lot of folks think about a process of elimination like that as a trick or a hack. But what I'm hearing you say is that it's actually a way to implement strategy. It's a way to think critically.
Absolutely right. And when it comes to the process of elimination, and specifically if we speak about the verbal reasoning section as well, what we usually suggest is there is no one approach to a question. Because what you might be able to do, for example, is you might look at the answer choices and just say, what do I want from the correct answer? And I'll give you an example. One of the questions that I would often teach would talk about a number of balls in a bag. And the question would say that a third of these balls are blue. And the question was asking, what is that number of the balls in that bag? And I usually ask people a question, what do you know so far about that number of the balls? And many people are going to have a little bit of a trouble initially figuring out what is it. But again, this is where you can learn what to look for. And this is what we teach in our classes. And you also learn different strategies. You know what strategies work or are likely to work in what types of questions. So going back to that particular question, the fact that the GMAT told us that the third of these balls are blue tells us that the number of the balls in the bag must be divisible by 3. Otherwise, there's no way for a third of them to be blue. And then we're looking at the answer choices and realize of the 5 options, 3 are not multiples of 3. So we can eliminate them so quickly without doing any math, just by realizing that these numbers are not divisible by 3. So there's no way that I can have 5 balls in a bag, because if I have 5 balls in a bag and a third of them are blue, then what's the number of blue balls? So that leaves us with 2 options. And then what do you do next? Well, you have 2 options. So in this particular case, the strategy that you could use is you could just say, oh, I have 2 answer choices. One of them is going to work. The other one won't. There's only one correct answer on the GMAT always. So what I can do is I can pick any one of them, the one that I think is easier to test, or the one that I maybe like the most, maybe the one that comes first, and I can just test it. I can just pretend the number of balls in that bag is, let's say, 12. And I can see if everything else works out. So now instead of trying to solve an algebra problem, I'm basically told I have 12 balls in this bag. Would everything else still work? And if I realize it works, that's great. That's the correct answer. And if I realize it doesn't work, then I know it's the other one. So essentially, I'm using a combination of the process of elimination as well as asking myself the right question. And I'm throwing in some other strategies as well. And this is what also helps a lot of the people, for example, that we work with, deal with very hard questions. Because the hard questions are hard not because the math somehow is much more difficult. They're hard because they might require multiple steps to get to the answer. And you have to be agile enough to recognize, well, first I do this, and then I do this, and then I do that. And sometimes you don't see all of these steps right up front, but you got to start somewhere. Let me take step 1. And then based on what I get, okay, so now I'm down to 2 options. Okay, what else do I do? What's the next step? Some people call these tricks. And to be honest with you, I've heard so many people saying, the only way to prepare for the test is you first have to learn the long way, and then you learn the tricks, maybe a little bit at the end. We believe in a slightly different approach. We believe that, yes, you do have to know some foundations, but foundations are, again, 40 pages in the book. It might take a few weeks to remember them. You might have to do some exercises, but it's really all coming down to how do you find the answer? What are the strategies? This is where you want to invest your time, because at the end of the day, you're recognizing these patterns in the questions. You're recognizing that it's not all about taking 20 algebra steps. It's about really thinking through the problem, because people who are successful in business, they're not necessarily people who are going to write pages and pages and pages of formulas. They're the people who are going to just analyze information and make confident decisions.
A lot of people think that quant is objective and verbal is subjective, but you argue that they're more similar than they seem. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, absolutely. And this is definitely what we hear a lot. Many people would say math is very black and white, because 2 plus 2 is always 4. Nobody could say it's 3. Nobody could say it's 5. Everybody can agree it's 4. So absolutely no subjectivity. There could be no disagreement. But verbal, when you're reading a question, the question would often say, which one of the following best supports? Right? So that means that we can disagree. Some people might believe it's B and some people might believe it's C. And that's why many people even believe to this day, you can't really prepare for verbal. You either have it or you don't. And what I've been able to see over the years working with different people, and certainly through my own training, is that this is actually not the case. So here's why. Yes, it is true that in math, if you go through all the steps and get to the answer, you will get a unique answer. The challenge, though, is that you don't have the time to go through all of these steps and get the exact answer. So you need to use your reasoning skills to get to the answer within 2 minutes. And sometimes it requires a little bit of a leap of faith. Sometimes you're looking at the question and just saying, okay, based on what I know, there's a 90% chance that the answer is A and not B. I can spend the next 5 minutes trying to bring this up to 100%, but I don't have this time. So I need to make this decision. And I'm going to choose A. It's a 90% chance, and I'm going to move on. I often tell our students also, if you can get to an 80% chance of getting the right answer in 30 seconds versus 100% chance in 5 minutes, you should always take the 80% chance in 30 seconds. Because if you have an 80% chance of getting the question right in 30 seconds, and you go through this through the test, and some of the questions you're going to be 100% right, but some of them, the cost of getting that little bit higher accuracy is just a much higher amount of time. It's just not worth it. In fact, I even tell our clients that it is better to get the question wrong in 30 seconds than get the question right in 10 minutes, which is something that really for many people hard to comprehend. Because if you're getting the question wrong in 30 seconds and you actually feel like you need 10 minutes, then that means a couple of things. First of all, you're going to have a lot less time for other questions that maybe don't require that much time that you definitely could get right. And secondly, if the question takes 10 minutes, the chance of you making one silly mistake somewhere along these 10 minutes is actually quite high. So there's quite a good chance that after spending 10 minutes, you're not going to get it right anyway. So that's math. And that's why math is a lot less black and white. If we had the 10 minutes per question, it would be very black and white, but we don't. Verbal, however, is a lot more black and white than many people think. Because in verbal, there's still always one right answer and 4 wrong answers. Always. That's just how the test is designed. When we think that there's more than one right answer, there's probably something that we missed. There may have been something that we just haven't paid attention to. And the challenge is that with verbal questions, very often, many people don't have the strategy. They don't really know what to look for. Like there's certain indicators, certain kinds of things they're looking for. And for example, trying to understand the structure of an argument as opposed to really getting buried very deep into the type of a content of the argument is much more important. I'd much rather know that the author begins by presenting a contrast opinion, then supports it, and then provides a counterexample and things like that, than actually try to understand what was that name of the molecule that they've thrown in. So if we know what to look for, then verbal becomes a lot more black and white. And then we know what makes the question right, what makes the question wrong. So at the end of the day, if we think about, verbal is very gray and math is very black and white, the truth is probably somewhere closer to the middle.
So given that, how do you prepare for verbal? Do you just become a better reader?
That is certainly an important factor. But similarly to other sections on the GMAT, verbal is about having the right skill set. The skills are quite similar. They are reasoning skills, asking the right questions, managing your time properly, making confident decisions. But of course, what you're going to be looking for in verbal is going to be quite different from what you're looking for in quant. In fact, in quant, there is a base knowledge that you need to acquire, which is, again, what's a fraction, what's the basic formula for probability and things like that. Whereas in verbal, it's almost purely skill. For example, reading efficiently is a skill. Taking good notes is a skill. Knowing how to break the tie between two answer choices is a skill. So while learning formulas in quant is helpful, in verbal, because every passage is going to be different, you really need to focus on developing the skill and asking the right questions, looking at the right things. Now, one of the skills in verbal that's actually very important is the skill of attention to detail. So many people would say, when it comes to attention to detail, you either have it or you don't. I really believe otherwise, because if you know what detail to look for, you're going to have a very good attention to detail. So if you pay attention to some specific things and again, some indicators, some keywords, some common structures, and if you look for them, you're going to be able to, again, recognize these patterns, and that's going to help you make decisions. So these skills are very important. And again, learning these patterns is very important. That's why in our classes, in our verbal classes, we teach not just efficient reading, which is definitely an important skill, but also recognizing what to look for, what details to look for that are going to help you answer the right question, what are the different types of questions, and then what are the different ways to choosing that answer.
I'm assuming that efficient reading is not just reading fast. It's reading with some amount of purpose.
You're 100% right. It's not about reading fast. And if we, again, go back to that phrase, work fast, but don't rush, some people just do it so fast and they miss important detail. Some people read very slowly and they try to capture everything, but then they realize they don't have enough time to answer the question. So it's about reading and paying attention to what's important and perhaps just glancing over what's not important. And again, this is where knowing what is really important is going to make a huge difference.
So even though some passages could be different, like, alluded to maybe one being about molecules, I think I've seen a passage about frogs. What are the similarities in these passages, even though the content is very different? Although I do know that frogs are made up of many, many molecules.
You're absolutely right. In fact, most of the things that I know right now that are just interesting tidbits of information that are probably quite useless for the overall life, but they make good conversation starters are the things that I know from reading comprehension passages. It's not really about the content. It is about the right structure. So if you are starting to pay attention to the structure as opposed to the content, and I usually, when we teach our students how to read efficiently, I would sometimes give them an example. If I give you an article and then you would read this article, let's say I'll give you 5 minutes, and come back to me and tell me about this article. What do you think was important? Well, most people are going to try to focus on the actual content. And again, keep telling me about the content. But that's actually for the GMAT, it's not that important because do I need to be an expert in frogs and molecules to go to a business school? Not really, no. But I need to be able to read information, maybe read contracts and understand what's important, what's not important. So on the GMAT, when it comes to passages, what's important is the structure of the passage. So if somebody comes to me and says, you know what, there was this scientist X who developed a certain theory, and then there's some challenges with this theory. And then scientist I came and tried to disprove the theory. While the author in this passage tries to contrast these two theories, brings then scientist Z, who is actually aiming to break the tie between these scientists, and the truth, according to the author, is somewhere in between. I'm going to say, wow, that's amazing. Even though you didn't tell me what the theory is, you're probably going to be okay answering most of the questions compared to somebody who's going to actually explain to me what that theory was, but didn't really quite grasp what the author was trying to do in the passage.
So how does this strategic prep for quant and verbal translate to data insights? I know that we talk about it at GMAC and other folks talk about it as sort of a really healthy marriage or blend of quant and verbal. Is that how you see it?
Yes, indeed. The way that we usually position the data insight section, it is a blend of your quantitative reasoning skills, verbal reasoning skills, and real life skills. Because with every question, or with the majority of the questions, you need to use a bit of combination of all of them. Imagine you're given, let's say, a multi-source reasoning question where there's some text that you're going to have to read. Well, we might be using our verbal reasoning skills to try to really grasp what's important in an efficient way. And then we might be given, let's say, a table. Well, maybe we'll use our spreadsheet skills to really try to, again, understand how this table is structured, what information is there. And then maybe some of the questions that are going to be asked are going to be the questions that will then ask us to combine this information from the text and from the table. And maybe they're going to ask us something like, what was the largest percentage increase between certain quarters in this company? So for that, we might need to use some of our math skills. And because we might have a lot of information in the table, even though we are given a calculator, we often don't have the time to try to divide all of these numbers. So we might need to use, again, the same skills we used in quant, like looking at some patterns, looking at what number is bigger, what number is smaller. The way to get the largest percentage increase, for example, is to make sure that your base is smaller and the new number is higher. So that's how you can find the answer. So that's why it really is the combination of all three. And the other skill that we usually throw in is the time management skill, because it's just such a fast-paced section. So you need to really work through the information fast, make sure that you don't get distracted by the amount of data, and really focus on answering the questions.
So, in addition to time management, I know that you've said that confidence is also one of the biggest barriers to success on the GMAT. How do you help students build that?
Confidence is a very interesting thing because confidence essentially allows us to make decisions. And decision making is a very important skill of a future CEO. I mean, let me ask you, have you ever heard of an indecisive CEO? They probably wouldn't stay as CEOs for a very long time if they're indecisive, right? Because that's their job, to make decisions. So confidence is really important. And that means that sometimes you just have to make a decision, even though you're not sure. So a couple of things there. Let's talk about the confidence when answering the questions and the overall confidence taking the test. So the more micro level confidence is when answering the questions. This is when you might be stuck between two options, B and C, and you just need to make a decision. Well, the way that we usually train our students is we help them really focus on what is the decision at hand. So for example, they're down to two options. How do you decide? Do you look at just one of them and decide whether it's right or whether it's wrong? Do you try to look at the difference between them? And sometimes there are different strategies that you can apply. But ultimately, it just comes down to just make a decision and move on. It is important. And this, again, comes back to being 80% sure versus 100% sure 10 minutes from now. On a more macro level, confidence gets developed through a few things. First of all, through proper preparation. Because if you're prepared for the test, you're going to be confident. I'll give you an example. I sail a boat, and the first time I was on a boat, I was very not confident. I didn't know what I was doing, and I was really afraid. But as I learned how to do it, now I go on a boat and I sail it, and I just having a blast. So the more you do that, the more you practice, the more you know what strategies to apply, the more confident you're going to become. And the second thing is just simply developing the confidence for the test day. And there are a few strategies that you can also take. One of these strategies that you can take is just as you're approaching your test day, continue doing things that make you feel really good about yourself. I mean, sometimes we even suggest, look, imagine you're a really good painter. Just paint a picture the day before the test. Feel really good about yourself, snap a picture, send it to all your friends. They're going to say, oh, wow, that's amazing. It's so beautiful. It's going to make you feel so good about yourself. And that's going to help you on the test day as well.
So, what would you say to someone who's just starting out their GMAT prep and they're feeling extremely overwhelmed?
Start by taking a deep breath. This is something that might take some time, but what's important to recognize is that this is a journey that's going to help you be more successful in your next steps. So when you're currently overwhelmed, take a practice test, maybe sign up for a consultation with a GMAT instructor, try to develop your study plan, break things down into smaller chunks. And remember why you're doing this. This is a process of self-development. When you're doing this test, this is not about memorizing a lot of information that is completely useless to you and you're going to forget the next day. This is about developing your own skills. So this is something that you're going to be benefiting from no matter what. That's why if you remember that the reason for doing this is really that process of investing in yourself, investing in your own skills. And if you're seeing some setbacks, then just try to see what you need to move forward. That's why if you have limited time to prepare, then working with a coach really helps. And in any case, we always suggest have a plan, break things down to smaller chunks. Just like we're going to do with longer questions. If the question is complicated and there's so many steps, just try to take it one step at a time. The same thing in the GMAT, one step at a time.
I totally agree that preparing for the GMAT, it's about self-development, and that's probably one of the best frames of mind that you can have in order to stay motivated. But at the same time, there's like a very real goal, which is a high score. While focusing and being motivated by self-development, how can a test taker improve their odds of scoring in those higher percentiles, especially if the schools that they want to apply to have a higher score range than others?
So if you want to increase your odds of getting a high percentile, then our advice is usually remember that analogy about driving a car. Learn the foundations first, and learn the strategies, recognize that you will be making mistakes. So learn how to work on your mistakes. And what we do, for example, in our classes is not only we provide feedback to our students, but we also teach them how to properly work on their mistakes themselves, so that when they're doing practice at home, they're not just doing hundreds and hundreds of questions. It's not about quantity, it's more about the quality. If you do 5, 10 questions in smaller chunks and then reflect on those questions, and most importantly, ask yourself a question: what can I do differently next time? And really adopt that mindset of continuous improvement, a little bit at a time. Learn something new, think about what are you going to do differently, and then try again, and then try again, and then try again. And remember, making mistakes while you're learning is awesome, because the mistake you make while you're learning is probably the mistake you're not going to be making on a test day. And if you're making mistakes, that means you're learning.
Speaking of your program, at a very high level, what does that journey look like for a student from their first session to ultimately achieving their goal score?
So when we work with our clients here at AdmitMaster, their journey begins even before they set foot in a class. If somebody were to take our life coaching program, and we do offer other programs as well, where some self-study, self-directed programs that they could follow with or without the instructor help. But when it comes to that life program that has a specific schedule, then the moment they register for our class and pay a deposit, we are going to give them access to the foundational resources and exercises. So that's step number one: learn how to multiply and add fractions and read passages. That is something they begin working on even before the first class. And we use a couple of different approaches, but we believe very strongly in learning by doing. So that's why instead of just simply asking them to read how to add 2 fractions, we actually give them a lot of exercises where they are going to be adding fractions, finding square roots of numbers, so that they actually get very fast and very familiar with this process. And then when they come to the class, we essentially start driving a car, if we use that analogy. We are going to be teaching them strategies. They're going to have an opportunity to practice. A lot of the questions we're going to be using in class are very tricky, so they're going to have a chance to ask questions, try things out, fall into traps. We're going to have this discussion. So by the time they leave the class, they're going to be feeling, wow, now I can actually do this. And what's going to be important afterwards, of course, is that they practice. So every week, every class, we're going to assign them homework. We use the official guide, the latest edition for homework. So we're going to give them specific types of questions to practice. And we're going to expect that they're going to be practicing and asking for help. So this is how they continue to reinforce the skills that they learn in class. The journey, though, doesn't end at the end of the scheduled classes. We continue supporting our clients. We give every client who comes to a live class complimentary 3 hours of one-on-one tutoring, so they can always come back and ask questions. We have a very strong support system, and we even have a free repeat policy, so that they can come back to the class no matter what, no questions asked, if they simply feel that they need a little bit more. And then we support them through the whole process as well. We have an arm of our business that does admissions consulting as well. So we really want to make sure that they're successful in this whole process. If you go to our website, admitmaster.com, you will see that every 2 weeks approximately, we offer sample classes. So you can come to this class, you can learn a little bit more about our approach. You can look at some of the questions, and we'll talk a little bit more again about this whole process of studying, so that we can leave you with the specific study plan. And most importantly, get in touch with us. You can go on our website, book a one-on-one consultation. You feel free to send us your resume, and we can talk a little bit more. I'm very passionate about this. At some point, I decided to leave my corporate career and do this full time. So if there's anything we can do to help, then please just get in touch with us. We are here to help. At some point, MBA changed my life when I did my MBA 20 years ago, and now I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to work with wonderful people who are the future leaders. And I'm already seeing such a big impact that our students are making on this world, and not-for-profit and corporate world, in the government. So if you are the future leader, that you feel that there's something more for you, something bigger, and you're very ambitious, then please get in touch. I would love to speak.
You went from a chunky paycheck to chunky fractions. Sergey, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. I can't wait to have you back.
Thank you so much, Zach. It is my pleasure. And for everyone else, good luck, and make sure that if you have your dreams, don't give up. this opportunity to change your life, affect the lives of other people, and really make a difference in this world.
Couldn't say it better myself. That's it for today's episode. If you're ready to start your own GMAT journey, head to mba.com, admitmaster.com, and of course, subscribe for more episodes of Inside the GMAT. I'm Zach. This has been Inside the GMAT, and until next time.